Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel. So we're doing one of these because the content gods have once again graced us with their presence and given us this one. Now this one was scheduled, so I want to give a little bit of a reaction to kind of the live stream done by Dakota, Sports Cards Anonymous, when I was watching like a lot of other folks, and I kind of watched again after the fact and took a couple of notes here and there. And he had on Chris from House of Jordans and Card Ladder, and of course Kristina from Card Ladder as well, but and formerly House of Jordans as well. But kind of the context of the subject ended up being very interesting. It was a conversation on the whole idea of sports card content, specifically playing off of the discussion and kind of the IG story storm that Chris put out in regards to this kind of content, doubling down on it on the crossover and talking about those various things. So of course we're having a discussion on sports card content. It's like, sign me up. This is exactly the kind of thing that I'm into talking about. So we're going to get into that. Now, of course, the original I've talked about some of the original IG stories and those elements of it. And I questioned the wisdom of actually posting it in the way they decided to do it, in kind of the incendiary way, leaving it kind of open-ended and broad. And Dakota does touch on a lot of these themes and subjects in the discussion. Now, one thing that I specifically was trying to figure out, and this is something I was working on because I had about 4 or 5 different ideas of how I could have approached this video. And the truth is, probably the simplest possible way was to include some clips interspersed with it, and I'm going to. But obviously, I'm using the StreamYard setup here to do the share screen. Truthfully, I started kind of watching through, and I tried to figure out and piece out what clips I could pull. And the truth was, a lot of Chris's answers go for 2 or 3 minutes. So in the end, I realized that I'd probably be playing half the video anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to play the whole thing in its entirety. I am going to skip ahead, and I am going to utilize the editing abilities after I download this and then re-upload it onto YouTube. I am going to cut to different segments of it, but then I'm going to play a clip for you, and then I'm going to talk through kind of my thoughts on it and give a little bit of kind of a rebuttal, a retort to a lot of this stuff, and give my own opinion and my own take. Now, before I continue with that, I do want to say a couple of specific things. First of all, this whole segment and this whole thing coming about in this way, of course, amuses me. Now, and I'm going to get into more of that in a second. But I want to just tell you that I'm recording this. It's 5:43 in the afternoon, almost 5:44. So it's past 5 o'clock. I've turned off the work computer for now, and I've got, AEW Dynamite on later on, so I want to be able to watch that in peace. But I am going to record this beforehand and hopefully get it up tonight. And it's a good day. When it is Wednesday, in addition to knowing what that means, in this case, what that means is the BIC mug is out. I've got my porter in hand. It is cold. I am ready. We're going to do this thing. And let me assure you, if nothing else, I guarantee some hashtag scholarship will be had right now. It's going to happen. But before I do that, and as I pour this, what I'm going to actually say, I want to do a little precursor to this. And it's important because what I think it'll do is it'll actually set the tone for the rest of the video. Because when I go into this, I operate on 2 levels on this channel for those of you who are less familiar. I do like to talk about some of these topics in more of a deep dive kind of way. But of course, I don't take anything really fully seriously. So of course, I will interject some of my own little bit of sass into the whole thing. But at the same time, I do think it's a good topic to have, a good discussion to have as far as this is concerned. And this created a kind of a great opportunity to discuss it. But before you continue, I think it's important that we understand what the prism is that I'm going to look at this through. And that is the way that I operate my own content on this channel. And for those of you who are less familiar or are newer to the channel, it's probably a good time to give a refresher or reminder to those of you who are new. And then to those of you who have been around a while, it's a good idea just to get a state of where the channel is today. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the channel, but the short version of it is that it started off life as being just a place for me to deposit certain videos when I wanted someone to be able to see it. Like a lot of other folks on YouTube, I've had this channel for quite a long time. But then years and years and years ago, I decided to start kind of leaning into making some content that had a little bit of a structure. I tended to talk about different collecting things that I was into. What really stuck, I think, the most at that time period was talking about movies and talking about Blu-rays and stuff. And I still have a lot of that Blu-ray collection. I probably have about 350 Blu-rays still laying around. But I did lose a lot of the passion for talking about it that way. And I don't really watch movies too much anymore. But I do have a great library if I do get back to it. And probably there's some stuff there that I probably should watch. The bottom line is, as I went through the evolution of the channel, I took a little bit of a break. And then right around the fall of 2018, I want to say in September 2018, I decided to do something with the channel. And what I decided to do was to get into the sports card genre. And the reason for that is I've been collecting the whole time. I started collecting in 1990, and I'm one of those few folks who actually stuck around collecting the whole way through. The only real slowdown that I had was in university, but slowdown meant instead of actively searching for cards all the time, it meant I would scour eBay maybe on weekends. If I found anything inexpensive, key being inexpensive, I didn't have a lot of money, I'd pick up things here and there, and then I'd have them shipped off to the house. And then when I went back home during breaks from school, I would have a pile of mail waiting for me. So I was still participating in the hobby, even though to a much scaled back scale, since again, I didn't really have a lot of money lying around while I was in university. But after I was done with that and I got into the working world and did my thing, I got back into cards like normal. About around 2018, I decided to start making videos because honestly, I thought the content space at that point was kind of lame. So I decided to make it. But I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. But I want you to understand that's what the channel started off as from the sports card side of things. I've been using for other things. Then in 2018, I got into sports cards late in 2018, and that's when I started doing that. That's why the videos going back before that are not going to be sports card related. Now, with that said, going forward, I kind of found my niche in terms of talking about different topics and kind of the way that I'm going to do tonight. And it was kind of an area that was a lot of fun for me because then I could do a little bit more of a deep dive and talk through different aspects of it. And that's really what I enjoyed, and that's where I had my fun. And at the same time, I didn't stop making videos that are more collector-centric. And this is an important distinction I want to make here. That's why I say this whole preamble here is just to set up, again, what I'm going to go through when I go and talk about the elements that happened in that live stream. I want you to understand the prism I'm seeing it through. So when it comes to content, most content falls into a couple of different buckets. There are folks that talk predominantly flipping and investing content. There's that element of it. There are breakers that do that kind of thing. There are folks that do more collector-oriented content. And then there are folks that try to do a little bit headier stuff, and that'll come into play a little bit later on with this stuff here, that do a little bit more commentary, opinion, punditry. Well, and then there's folks that do kind of more newsy stuff. Now, if you watch this channel and check through the various aspects of it, the live stream is kind of its own unique beast in terms of it's part debate show, part us just hanging out, part of us just having fun. There's different elements of that. But we do get into some more serious discussion and topics. And the excerpt that I put on the channel last week, or was it last week? Maybe it was this week. Anyway, time flies. But regardless, the last excerpt that I put on from the live stream basically captured that beautifully. And that was in the sense there was an opportunity where Jay was able to come in as a lawyer and give us a little background and give us some thoughts on kind of how the whole Marks cards thing was playing out as far as PSA having a motion rejected, what the next steps were, and what that might look like from his opinion. Well, that was a great, unique insight that we were able to provide. In the same live stream that we're talking about other silliness and making fun of HGA and doing this, that, and the other thing. And it's one of those things where I've got this weird balance. This channel doesn't fit neatly into any of the buckets I just described to you. It's a hybrid. It does talk about news. It does talk about punditry and opinion. It does have collector-centric content when I do my pickup videos and when I talk about, showcases of different sets and things that I'm working on and some of my thought process behind that. So it's got all these different elements that comprise normally their own standalone piece of content. And the reason for that is because that is the way that I've chosen to run this channel. This channel operates on the editorial content that I want to do. And that's an important distinction because that's what the channel is. Now let's talk about what the channel isn't. The channel is not a predominantly news channel. The channel is not a watchdog channel because I openly reject the idea of the self-appointed watchdogs of the hobby and people that want to try to position themselves as, trying to protect the hobby from these various things. I'm a big believer in allowing people to make their mistakes. And if they don't learn from their mistakes and they refuse to use the resources around them, I'm not very sympathetic. So in that sense, I'm not very often on the side of discussing that or trying to protect anybody from themselves, because it's like we all learned who have been here for a while. We learned by making mistakes. We learned by screwing up. We learned by then adapting and adjusting and moving forward. Now, that might seem to some as a more jaded approach for who want to give everybody the white glove treatment, but I really just don't feel that that's something that's necessary. I also don't feel the hobby needs to be taken that seriously to that degree. I think it's something that people should be able to come and go, be transient if they wish, participate heavily if they want to. And I think that level of freedom is something that they should be allowed to have. Now, in the content space, there is a level of freedom as well, in the sense that, my opinion, is that there is room for almost any kind of content you want. Even the stuff that people really hate in terms of the flipper content and all that kind of thing. The proof is in the pudding as far as the viewership is concerned. You can keep harping on this being taking advantage of an ignorant audience, but at the same time, it's like any other aspect of life. If you refuse to learn, you refuse to adapt, and you refuse to go into things with your eyes open, again, I don't feel particularly bad for you. I'm very laissez-faire when it comes to the whole idea. So I always kind of push back against folks that really desperately want to have regulation or tell people what to do or how to do it. That plays into this whole discussion we're about to have here that we're going to play for. One more thing I want to mention really quickly as well is that in the same vein, that's why you're going to see what may seem on the surface like inconsistency about when I decide to go after certain folks and when I don't. The truth is, I do it when I feel it's appropriate. I do it when frankly I feel like it. And my criteria is that I'm looking for not the specific folks that are, necessarily hypocrisy, because there's lots of hypocrisy in this hobby. But when I feel like it's egregious, or when I feel like it's somebody who's positioned themselves in a certain place as far as the hobby is concerned, so that tends to put them a little bit more in my focus. Also, I'm looking more for the bank robberies and murders as opposed to the jaywalking. So if somebody's worried about hypocrisy, they're like, oh, but so-and-so is, doing this Hippocratic thing. Yep. I can find you 100 more examples of that. So what? Go find a meter maid. Go find somebody who doesn't have enough tickets for the day. Go bug them. They can go make 100 videos on it if you want, and just keep harping the same thing as if anyone cares. I prefer to discuss, and I also, most importantly, I prefer mainly to discuss it, even if it is something that could normally fall under that category. If I feel like there's an opportunity to have a greater discussion for it, then it's more interesting for me. And the proof is in the pudding with that. Only a couple of weeks ago, we had the thing with the infamous Jeremy Lee, as far as the whole little mini controversy with him at the card show, trying to hunt down somebody to try to do a little reversal on a deal where it didn't work out in his way because he didn't price the card correctly. Now, anybody who knows the channel for a little while knows that I have my own personal feelings about the floating head. However, if it had just been piling on that, I don't think that would have been a very useful conversation, and I don't think it would have been worth it. It would have been worth some fun pot shots, but that is not a useful piece of content for me. The usefulness came that we were able to then use that as a deeper conversation with a nice panel discussion on the live stream. We were able to have a nice panel discussion on what's the responsibility of the dealer for their stuff, for their own business, and what's the responsibility of the buyer. Should the buyer have, some moral compunction to correct the dealer if they make an egregious mistake that doesn't work out in their favor? And Eric brought that side of it. Sanderson or on the show, Eric brought that stance. And even though I didn't agree with it, and a lot of the chat and the rest of us didn't agree with it either, however, the fact that he took that stance made for an excellent debate. So he brought a great element to it that we were all able to have a great discussion, because I think there were 6 of us on the screen at the time, but we were able to have a great discussion about that. The Mark's Card thing. A lot of people just complain about the Mark's Cards thing, and then just throw out a million theories and all this, that, and the other thing. We were able to have Jay come on, and he was able to actually give us some insight with his expertise in order to facilitate the discussion. That to me is a meaningful discussion. That's a useful discussion, rather than, oh man, this guy sucks and they're bad for the hobby. Good. Fair enough. Why else would I care? Oh, that's it? That's all you got? Oh, great. Good to know. There's a lot of people that people think are bad for the hobby, and a lot of times it's because they don't like them. And that's fine, but just understand that there are people in the hobby that I don't like either. And there are people in the hobby that certainly don't like me. But I don't care about that. That's useless information if it doesn't come with some kind of a discussion or conversation. Like I said, the floating head discussion, it could have just been piling on for the sake of piling on, and sure, I would have had my fun and had my pot shots. But that's a 2-minute or 5-minute conversation. Not probably it was the better part of an hour. We talked for a good chunk of time and had a really good spirited debate. So in that specific instance, rather than just focusing on the piling on specific, we were able to have a great debate, and it encouraged and motivated some other folks to have their own debate on their own about the relative merits of this idea. That is where I think the value comes into that kind of thing. That's where the content really hits. Now, tonight, our focus is going to be on this conversation. So I know it was a really long preamble, I understand, but this is going to be a long video no matter what, so I apologize. The point is, now we're going to get into this. I'm going to zip through chunks of it. I'm going to play certain clips for you, and then I'm going to talk about some of the pieces of what we hear. And the other key piece is that I'm going to speed it up slightly to 1.25 just so that it gets through a little bit quicker. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, so I'll stop and start. And I will use some editing in order to get us to the different segments that I think are appropriate to discuss. So enough from me. That is probably the longest preamble in YouTube history. So now we're actually going to get into the matter at hand. All right, folks, so the magic of editing, we are here for the main event. I've skipped ahead almost 2 minutes into the discussion because this is the first piece. This is where Chris actually explains some of the sentiment that led into this entire conversation in the first place. So Dakota sets it up, and then Chris is going to talk about it. I'll play it for a bit, and then I'll come back, and then we're going to talk about it.
And coming out of that, Chris, you went on a podcast and you said, you know what? I had an epiphany, or it might have been a thought you were chewing on for a while. And you said the card content today that's being produced is not going to it's not going to lure serious people, serious investors, serious money. Would you care to expand on this thought? Yeah,
I'd love to. Present company obviously excluded Dakota.
Okay, yeah.
And Kristina. And yeah, I don't mean all content, but I think we do have this, and it's the mint provoked this thought because the purpose of the mint was, and I think they succeeded to some extent, to raise the bar in terms of how the hobby presents itself to prospective investors. And I'm not the first one to jump on the train and say, we need investors, and this is an investment space, and this is an asset class. That's not my lane. That's really not the way I like to approach the hobby whatsoever. But there is something to be said for bringing in investor-oriented people in order to generate sustainable growth for our industry over the long term. And looking at the way the Mint bundled and packaged its content was pretty inspiring. But one of the drawbacks that continued to occur when I was conversing with people at the Mint was they feel that it's difficult to take the sports card industry seriously when the offering on the content menu is not of a serious variety. And instead it can feel like some combination of a multi-level marketing approach combined with a late night TV infomercial. And I can't help but disagree with it. I can't help but agree with that. Go ahead.
Well, Kristina, is there anything you'd like to add or share your thoughts on this?
I just think that we can all do better. And as a community, we should expect better. And that's not just for content, but behavior in the hobby as well. And yeah, that's just my thought. So
let's stop here. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to touch on what Kristina said as far as people's behavior in the community, because we know that there's always some trolling and some element of that. That's never really going to be a good thing. Unfortunately, that is a lot of internet culture, and that a lot of that isn't going to go away. But at the same time, doesn't mean we can't aspire or try to do better on that front. So I think that's a fair point, and that's an agreement with it. Now, the first piece of pushback that I want to give on this. Remember, he said that the Mint Collective was kind of his inspiration for this. The Mint Collective that, of course, Kristina helped organize and was a big part of, and the Card Ladder team was a big part of it in general. But the key piece of this is that we're discussing this whole idea of this community. And Kristina makes the point here that as a community, we should strive for better from the behavior standpoint, of course, which I just said makes perfect sense, but also from the content standpoint. The problem is, and this is my first piece of pushback on this general idea, and it's going to come up again when Chris talks about some of these other elements. The sports card hobby is not a homogeneous whole. And I want you to remember that. It is not a homogeneous whole. It is a disparate group of individuals who do bunch up into various clusters. It's probably less to think of it as like this one big community as opposed to being a series of fiefdoms. And people kind of come and go transiently. Some of them spend their entire lives hanging out in one fiefdom, and that's kind of their area that they enjoy. Sometimes they'll go and venture off and take a little trip over 5 fiefdoms down. And that's really the relationship of a lot of it. So they can have a good relationship with groups in these different fiefdoms, these little kingdoms that are happening. But the kingdoms aren't all aligned. They don't have the same agendas. There are people that operate in these different spaces. Some of them operate with more money. Some of them operate with less. Some of them really are very pure in the collecting sense that they reject third-party grading. They want everything to just be collector focused. There are other folks that have a little bit of a business mindset into it. There are a lot of folks that are angled all the way at the end of the spectrum where money's the only thing that matters. And they all fall under this gigantic umbrella that is the hobby. So in other words, and again, this will come up later as we get into more of Chris's discussion, is that there is no one size fits all for content. And the idea that there could be content that maybe would be more attractive to the audience that Chris is discussing about here, which he will repeat later on in this discussion, is fine. But at this point in time, understand what has been said, is that he's suggesting that maybe there should be a consideration of having content that could be attractive to this group. However, that later on, he would then go into trying to angle for, the decrease of other kinds of content in order, presumably, I guess, to make space. But here's the truth. The barrier to entry on content is actually fairly low. So realistically, this investor-friendly content, so to speak, could be made now with the other stuff still in effect. There is another element to it where he talks about kind of the hierarchy or the pecking order of this content, and I think that's crucially important. But for now, just understand that you can have this investor-friendly content while the other stuff's going on at the exact same time. So at that point, then, okay, great. So either make it yourself or advocate for people that you feel are qualified to make it, and then go make it. The rest of this discussion shouldn't even be happening at that point. It's like, look, if you really feel that this needs to be made, go make it. But your contention is that the other content is creating a block, and that's what we'll get into a little bit more. But just remember that. And also remember that a lot of the inspiration he got from the Mint Collective is based on this notion that he's talking to some people. And I want to come back to that. And when we get to that, we're going to have some hashtag scholarship. We're going to have some fun with that.
So, I mean, what is this content that you think that, should be avoided or that, isn't pushing the hobby forward?
Yep. Let me just add one more piece of context here, which is we're at a point in the hobby where we need a referendum on the current faces and the current leadership in the content space. I believe we experienced an enormous amount of growth over the last 2 years that that couldn't be dissuaded by good or bad content. It was happening. It was organic. It was generated at the grassroots level. And if there was bad content sort of representing itself as the face of our industry and of our hobby, it was sort of besides the point. People were just loving the hobby. But over the last 9, 10, 12 months, the metrics I look at indicate that most sectors of this hobby have either stagnated or they've depreciated. And that means that either people are really tightening the purse strings or people are leaving. And I think it's a little bit of both. Nothing wrong with people wanting to spend less. The collector in me loves the fact that prices go down sometimes. But the objective analyst in me says these are not encouraging signs if, and this is my bias, I'm a big stakeholder in my personal life in this industry. I want to see this industry do well. And it matters to me personally. It matters to me professionally that this industry does well. And so my opinion is that it's time for a referendum. And it's time to take a look at the leading faces of our content and decide if this is the path that we want or if there's a different path that we'd like to take. So I'm not just firing shots and catching people with strays for the sake of doing it. I really care about the growth and the improvement of this industry. And when the market indicators are telling me that the industry is shrinking and that people are leaving it, I want to figure out why. And so then your question was, well, what is bad content? Or what does bad content look like?
Okay, I'm going to stop before we get to the Michael Saylor talk. But you can see what the problem I ran into was when I was trying to figure out what kind of content to make for this. I thought, well, I can just do a sit down where I'll just talk through some of the key points. But it takes Chris like 5 minutes to make one point. So so I have to kind of let it play a little bit for you. By the way, just maybe I should have mentioned that off the top. My bad. I am including a link in the description to the full thing. If you just want to sit there and watch it in one sitting without my commentary, you can just watch it. Go ahead. It's already there. Feel free to enjoy it. And Dakota did a very good job, so I commend him for it. Now, one important thing is we're talking about here. So now this is where we mentioned we mentioned a referendum, and we mentioned it twice. Now, being in Canada, we know a thing or two about referendums. And just for the record, anybody who calls for a referendum, it doesn't always work out the way you think it's going to. Now, here's my contention on this piece. The truth is that the hobby conducts a referendum as far as sports card content is concerned every single day. Every video that is made has the ability to generate and go viral at any time. And it is really up to the individuals who decide to either partake in it or not partake in it. And obviously, there's some accusations thrown later on in this discussion, which we'll touch on when we get there. But the bottom line is, to a certain degree, the subscriber count, not even the subscriber count, but the view count on these videos, the proof is in the pudding. The audience is telling you what they want or don't want based on what they're watching. And later on, Chris and Kristina both try to make some points that they'll talk about, fake views, fake subscribers, things, vanity metrics that are designed to get clout. But again, when we get to that point, I'll push back on that specific piece. But already out of hand, I reject the notion that you need a referendum because we're constantly doing one. We're doing one in real time every single day. When I make this video, my channel's smaller in terms of its general reach because I do go deep dive into a lot of these topics. It's not as exciting as some of the flipper content, and some people like the way I do it and some people don't, and a lot of people won't. So it's one of those things where the crowd will decide for themselves. But any engagement I get on the video helps the video. If somebody hits the like button and hits a subscribe, it helps the video. That's part of the way the algorithm works. And the algorithm will then look at what's getting that engagement and then promote it higher up on the list. And that's just the way this works. Now, that's very much a merit-based thing. The algorithm you don't have control over, but if the audience is engaged with what you're doing, if they are interested in what you have to say, then they will follow. And whether the view count is there or not, one of the metrics that I like to use that usually is very indicative is your average watch time of the video. Because what happens is even if you have 1 million views if basically the average watch time is 30 seconds, then that means you got 1 million views, but people click on, see that they're not interested in what they're seeing, and then immediately click off. That's not really that great. However, you could have 100 views on a 10-minute video. If the average watch time is 9 minutes, then at least those 100 people were actively engaged with what you were talking about. You do understand that those 100 views were higher quality views, and we'll get into the whole quality thing a little bit later on in this video here. But the point is that to me, already a lot of the discussion betrays a misunderstanding of what this is, a misunderstanding of what quality quote unquote content is versus content that I like. And content that I like can be a very different thing. I can enjoy different types of content for different reasons. That's why I say, like, at the very beginning, I push back on the notion that this required, while I like having the debate over the idea of what is good content and what is not good content, we can have that till the cows come home. However, when it comes to this kind of thing, we started this whole thing off because there was a bit more of a judgment placed on it. And there will be more as we go forward in this discussion, different elements where I don't think Chris sets up his position very well and leaves a lot of room for a lot of questions going forward from there. So now he's going to get into the whole bit about the Michael Saylor thing. I'll finish up with that, and then I'll get into one more thing here with this.
And a big Bitcoin investor. And by the way, I'm not a huge fan of cryptocurrency or the metaverse or NFTs, but I listen to people in that space. And Michael Saylor appeared on a podcast, Patrick Bet-David's podcast, not that long ago. And he expressed why he invested in Bitcoin. And he said it was the summer of 2020. And he came to the belief that he needed to move his money or his value from cash, and he needed to put it somewhere else. And so he looked at as a way to hedge against inflation. So he looked at putting it into art, he looked at putting it into real estate, and he looked at putting it into cryptocurrency. And he ultimately settled on cryptocurrency. And the reason why, this is part of the epiphany, the Chris Hoge silly epiphany, is that the reason why he decided to go with Bitcoin was there was scholarship that was drawing from the Austrian School of Economics that proposed theoretical explanations for why Bitcoin was a desirable hedge against the inflation with respect to the US dollar. And he said point blank that scholarship is what encouraged him to put hundreds of millions of dollars into Bitcoin. Now, the great irony of that from our point of view as sports cards people is that had he put that money instead of Bitcoin, had he put it into football cards, the returns would have been 6x, whereas Bitcoin was 4x. Had he put it into Tom Brady cards, the returns would have been 8x instead of 4x. So
now this is intellectually dishonest, and I'll tell you why. Because even if that number could be true, a lot of it depends on if he had decided to enter into the sports card space. And we're making assumptions now. Now we're fully fledged into assumption territory. If we decide to make the assumption that, okay, he's going to go into sports cards, why, as opposed to some other asset that basically is just arbitrage? To be clear, sports cards make money by arbitrage. You buy and then you sell. That's it. There's no other magic to it as far as that's concerned. We've tried to create all these other mechanisms to try to create some other value out of it, the whole fractional space, a lot of this stuff, and even vaulting to a certain degree. We're trying to basically reduce the amount of friction to what is a transaction that is rife with friction. And I'll probably touch on that in a little bit. But the point is that even assuming he had decided to go into the space, and I reject the notion that he would have gone into the space had this quote-unquote scholarship been available. Because really, sports cards is a tremendously inefficient market for this kind of investment. Why would you spend $500 million on something that is not liquid? Even the most liquid cards still require a little bit of work in order to get them out of your hands. You still have to send it somewhere or have it already put somewhere and then get it transferred over to somebody else, have money change hands, do that whole thing. To be blunt, if it's a speculative investment that you're looking for as a hedge of some kind, and it's questionable how much of a hedge crypto still is compared to the dollar, but even if you consider it to be a great hedge, great. It's much easier for me to send Bitcoin from point A to point B. And then later on, if you had taken the same Michael Saylor example and listened to other subsequent interviews and discussions on this topic, which I have, then you would realize that Michael Saylor is now espousing a lot of Bitcoin's virtues. Specifically, he focuses on Bitcoin. But Bitcoin's virtues, he's got a lot of them as far as that's concerned. So he's clearly done his digging beyond the initial scholarship on its potential as a hedge against inflation. And he's leaning a lot more in, at least publicly, on some of the potential benefits and the transformative nature of the technology. Whether he believes that or not, or whether he's using it to pump up Bitcoin is a different conversation. But the whole idea of whether it be 6x or 8x, it depends on what he's buying, when he's buying it, and what he buys. All we got to do is look at the example of Drake doing the box openings with Ken Golden. What if he comes in and he gets advice to open a bunch of unopened boxes, to get a bunch of boxes and open them? The ROI on that is horrific. He could be well into the negative percentages. So it's not just a matter of bringing in money. It's a matter of bringing in money and putting it in the right spot. Who's advising you? And like I said, we talked about this whole idea, this referendum. Let me touch on the referendum piece real quick again. This whole idea is based on this premise that there is a definitive de facto face of the hobby. And then, we've got to have a referendum on deciding, who the face of the hobby is. It's like, dude, I started this whole conversation off with the basic idea that there is no homogenous whole. There are fiefdoms and different agendas and all these things competing with each other, even inside of the overall hobby space. We can't even agree on a lot of the basics. Why on earth do you think we have a face of the hobby? Who follows this face of the hobby that you proclaim to have? And the problem is, you're saying we have a face of the hobby, and yet you never cite who that is. You don't want to name names, but at the same time, you're saying we've got to push up against it. Who? Who are we pushing up against? We assume you're referring to someone like a Jeff Wilson, but the problem is, even at 150,000 subscribers, he's not the face of the hobby. I'm sorry, he's just not. He's not even the face of the sports card YouTube. He happens to have the most subscribers, but that in and of itself does not give him any special power or impact beyond his subscriber base. And his job predominantly on that channel is to sell a market tool, much like the market tool you have. So the reality is that he's no more the face of the hobby than Jab's family is. He's no more the face of the hobby than, Packer Cards 87. They have a lot of subscribers too, but nobody is accusing them of being the face of the hobby. And they have pretty darn good subscriber counts and pretty good views on their videos. But because they're not perceived as being in the space business-wise, then they're not the face of the hobby. And one more point I'll make on this. Even at the apex, even at his greatest apex, James Beckett was never the face of the hobby. And no name was more ubiquitous with the sports card hobby than Beckett. Beckett was the magazine. Beckett was the books. Beckett was the Beckett media empire. But he was basically a brand name. Growing up in the hobby, even in 1990, I couldn't have picked Beckett out of a lineup if you put a gun to my head. And it was only a couple of years ago I even knew what the guy looked like. I don't care about Jim Beckett. I do not care in the least about this guy. He has a great place in the hobby as far as developing these guides. He was an inventor of them, but he popularized them. He created this whole cottage industry with that. And obviously the rest of the Beckett media, BGS, he was around during that time. So there were a lot of great impacts in the hobby that he is very responsible for or has a big hand in. But at the same time, he was never the face of the hobby. He couldn't make the pronouncements inside of the publication itself that had a lot of sway. But even today, people are still kind of rejecting some of the things that are thrown out there. The XRC is still a contentious thing. So even Beckett didn't have the power to really wield. And no one was more ubiquitous with the hobby at that time than Beckett. When the hobby was quote unquote smaller and one person could have even more impact, you're telling me that a guy who is by every metric smaller is the face of the hobby? Again, he never names him as being the person, but then if not him, who? Ken Golden? Ken Golden's not the face of the hobby. Come on now. So the problem is there is no the face of the hobby. That's my point. That's really my main point on this whole piece. But we'll move on from here.
We're sitting here holding the secret close to the chest that we have an asset class in sports cards that's outperforming over long periods of time things that are seen as almost flukishly good investments like cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin. And we have things
factually incorrect. And your own metrics prove it. Because if we go back further than 2019, 2020 and thereabouts, a lot of these categories were very static. Not stalled, by the way. Some of them were going up, but they weren't seeing these appreciably huge gains. Part of the appeal of cryptocurrency right now is that it still has that volatility because that allows for the potential for some very cleverly placed arbitrage. Because let's not get this twisted. Bitcoin and those cryptocurrencies are still operating on our arbitrage model. It just happens to be a more efficient arbitrage model. Any costs that are related to doing the exchanges are basically the same kind of thing you would have where, oh, you sold a card for $1 million on Golden. Well, there's a percentage to be paid. There is a fee. There are things built into it. So there are costs involved in order to get this transaction completed. Anything where it involves a large dollar transaction, there is generally a cost. So understand that if you want to make the argument that sports cards are a better quote unquote investment that outperforms it, that's fine. But you, my friend, are going to have to actually bring the data to back that up. So simply making it as a blanket statement is factually wrong. It's also intellectually lazy. Hashtag scholarship. We'll come back to that.
And we have obvious low-hanging fruit like Tom Brady cards. They're outperforming it by factors. So
go ahead. I got a couple.
For now, it's outperforming it for now. It has ups and downs like any other kind of an asset class. So it's one of those things where, like, I get the general premise of it, and I get that you want to pump the tires. You really want to pump the tires on sports cards, but it's not true. It's one of those things where there have been various little spikes along the way that got you to that point, and a lot of the conditions that are available for that are not necessarily in play anymore. Does that mean we're not going to have record prices going forward? No, we've still had record prices in certain categories and certain things. We've also had, in the same conversation, he talked about the stagnation and the pullback on it. So it's like, you can't have it both ways. So now you're in a stagnation and pullback, and now you need to produce the scholarly data that is going to bring in this additional influx of cash in order to rebolster it. But part of your whole premise was that it was inherently this much of a better asset class prior to the money coming in. Do you see where the problem lies here? This is a chicken or the egg situation. Like, guys, this outperformed it. That's why we need to bring in more money so that it can continue to outperform. Otherwise, it's stagnating and backing up, and then it's no longer outperforming to the same degree as before. Well, good then. So we're going to use a little bit of editing, and we're going to fast forward to another part of the conversation. We'll be right back.
Can the argument be made that we don't need to change our content? It's just that this class, this asset class, or this collectible doesn't appeal to Michael Saylor, and that's why he didn't end up here.
The argument could be made that content is not responsible, or the argument could be made that content is not going to bring in more people, that it doesn't matter what our content looks like. And the argument could be made that our content is not repelling people. Although I think that's a pretty ludicrous argument. I think ask any person of a moderately conservative nature to look into sports card investing, Google that phrase, and see if the content that turns up appeals to them and presents sports cards in a scholarly light that would be appealing to a more conservative oriented, careful investor. And I think the answer is going to be a resounding no. This content feels more like a multi-level marketing pitch about get rich quick on commodity base cards than it feels like a serious scholarly academic approach. So I think if one were to say, look, the content doesn't matter, okay, we can have that argument, but what can't be said is that our industry is not in a backslide right now, because it is. It certainly is. No matter which metrics we'd like to look at, in the aggregate, spending is down in terms of daily transaction volume and in terms of prices. And to me, one of the culprits is the fact that we have a content menu in the most visible places that is not appealing to the next layer of people that we'd like to appeal to, which is more, people who are a little bit more reserved, people who are a little bit more skeptical by nature, people who need to see more than a couple of hype videos and a couple of hype social media posts before they decide that this is a category that they'd like to allocate money to.
And Kristina, do you have a take on this?
I mean, I've heard this argument from Chris quite a few times now. Like I've heard the Saylor argument. To me, it's not about bringing in outside money. It's about what we as a hobby are willing to accept as a quote unquote like leader and industry like professional. And to me, it's just very simply not that. Like it's like the famous quote that a judge wrote about pornography. You know it when you see it, and you know bad content when you see it. You know cornball content, like Dakota, you asked for a definition. Like you know it when you see it. It's it's marketed towards people. It's pumped for the algorithm. It's funny thumbnails that they think will drive clicks, and it's something that like we're getting away from. Like we're not just YouTube personalities or Instagram influencers. There's an actual industry behind us, and I think that at a certain point we need to say like, okay, enough. Like we're not going to watch this. We're going to boycott this. We're going to make sure that people who behave like this aren't taken seriously by others in this hobby, so that people outside of this hobby don't think to take them seriously either.
Okay, so there's actually a couple of different things here. And this is kind of the crux, and I think Kristina did a better job summarizing, honestly, the crux of one side of this argument, and I'll touch on kind of Chris's piece here as well. The problem that we run into here is that everything that they said is perfectly fine in the context of what their sensibilities are for the content they're trying to look and cater towards. However, the problem is we're still presuming the original thing that I rejected right from the get-go, that there is a homogenous whole as far as the hobby is concerned. There are people that watch some of the content, which again, you don't specify who this supposed market leader is. That's your first problem. If you forget everything else, forget everything else I've said. Your first problem is that you're identifying a problem, but you refuse to identify the problem. Because then, if you were to do that, then we would actually have to have a debate on the relative merits of the content that you're having an issue with. Dakota does address it a little bit later on. We're all pretty confident that it's Jeff Wilson they're talking about. But again, I'm back to my original stance. Jeff Wilson's not the face of the hobby. He's not the leading content provider. He has a lot of subscribers, but not like by a factor of 10 or anything crazy. Like I gave some examples. Packer Cards 87. There's a lot of you who probably don't know who that is. That person actually has quite a number of subscribers. Jab's family. That is very notorious, very shifty, very shady. Tons of subscribers. There are people that hate watch some of these channels. So here's your problem. You're telling people, your premise here is that, well, we should boycott it so people realize not to take them seriously. There are people that are watching that perfectly are content not to take them seriously. And they're still watching. They're watching because for them it's entertainment. The problem and the mistake that you're making in this whole idea here is that you're presuming that everybody is watching content for the same reason that you're watching content. Most people are watching content for one of a couple of reasons. They want to be informed, they want to be entertained, or they want both. Entertainment can come in many forms. Kristina's statement about, I'll know what you see, bad content, actually that's not true. And the reason why I say it's not true, and I'll give you a quick story and then we'll get back to playing it. One of the things that I think, and it'll come into play later when Chris makes another statement that's just flat out wrong, but one of the things that comes into play is that I've got a lot of friends that I've worked on and had stuff on the channel with, and also had them on for live streams and stuff. And they're great collectors. They're very personable in the sense that it's enjoyable to have good conversations with them. We can have a good chat. But some of them, portray themselves, and you know who I'm talking about if you watch the channel regularly. They kind of identify more with kind of the OGs of the content space on YouTube and stuff like that. And they like the idea of promoting that sense of those OGs and talking about that time of community. And they like to go back nostalgically on those times. And Wesker Griff, as part of his videos for a little while, was kind of shouting out some of those old channels that some of their stuff just isn't active anymore, or whatever the case is. But they were some of the OGs that were around when he started making videos initially, many moons ago. And the thing is, I've watched a handful of them just to see kind of offhand and went and checked back some of them. And here's the thing. They are by definition collector content. It's passionate collector content. It's people having fun with it, trying to bolster a sense of community and all that. But here's the thing. And remember when Kristina said, bad content when you see it? The problem is what is bad depends on the person. That content they're highlighting as an example of the community of that time period, as the time capsule to those early days of those OGs on YouTube doing sports card content. I had a YouTube channel back in those days, but I wasn't making sports card content, so I can't count myself amongst them. But they were out there doing their thing. And here's the truth. I watched a bunch of those videos that they were recommended, and in my opinion, the videos suck. They're trash. Not because the person's a bad person. I don't know them. But the thing is, it sucks. It's not very good. It's both recorded and filmed with a potato. They ramble on for endlessly to eventually get to the point, hopefully. They oftentimes never do. It is very much community-oriented of the moment. The videos don't hold up. There is no underlying message. It's sometimes just incoherent babbling. Again, in my opinion. But they love that stuff because they knew those people. And for them, they interacted with them and they had good relationships with them. So understand that for them, it's good content. For me, it sucks. For me, that is bad content. I'll take Jeff Wilson's boring, derivative, overproduced content over that trash any day of the week. Some people aren't going to like that. I totally get it, but I don't care. I'm Carlos. I do what I want. It's my channel. But the truth is that for me, that content isn't great. But it doesn't fit my sensibilities. I'm not going to tell them not to make it. They want to make a comeback and make the exact same videos they were making in 2011? Have at it, man. I'm just not going to watch it, but have at it. I'm not going to downvote it. I'm not going to write mean comments. I'm just going to ignore it because it doesn't interest me. The style, the presentation, I don't care. It doesn't fit. It's not of the moment. So if somebody makes a video that I'm not interested in, I'm not going to watch it. But what's funny about this whole discussion is that all this time, over and over again, it's a call to action, a call to action, a call to action. And like I said earlier, we have a referendum on content every single day. Those little view counts that you want to discount the importance of, they are indicative of who has decided that this was worth their time. The algorithm can only do so much. It can present it in front of you, but if you watch it and you decide that it's not good, eventually it'll fade off your algorithm because it's going to become abundantly clear you're not watching it. You've got fooled once, shame on them. Fooled twice would be shame on you. So most people will get the hint the first time, realize it's not for them. So like I said, I'm being very harsh when I'm talking about that OG content. It's not for me. It's not something that I find entertaining. It's not something that I find engaging. It's not something that I find informative. A lot of times I already knew the stuff and I could have explained it in half the time. But that's okay. For other people, it might be wonderful. They might want to binge watch it for hours. That's great. But I'm not going to tell somebody not to watch it. I'm not going to tell somebody not to enjoy it. I'm not going to tell somebody what they should and shouldn't be watching. That's a critical point here in this conversation. So again, the referendum is happening daily, every single day, and it'll happen again tomorrow. But again, this is a disconnect in the understanding of what this community is, because I do believe that Chris and Kristina mean well when they're trying to give these ideas here, but they don't understand that they're residing within one fiefdom of many. You are talking to the people that hang out in this fiefdom. There are many other fiefdoms that are looking at what you're talking about. They're like, what the hell are you talking about? Oh, that Wilson guy? Yeah, I watched a couple of his videos a couple of years back, and it wasn't for me. So you want to tell me not to watch it? Cool, I'm already not watching it. But who are all these other guys who are watching it? That's the point. And that's kind of a thing you got to kind of bear in mind.
You've talked about, I guess you've kind of even hit on it here. And we talked about, Kristina, you just talked about, people having kind of goofy thumbnails driving big clicks. Chris, you and Josh talked about influencers just caring about, getting more views and getting more reach. And I would kind of fight back against what y'all are saying. Y'all are saying the content needs to go this way. But if the views on YouTube and the clicks are going, the other direction, why?
Well,
why
I would say,
direction it should go?
I would say, are they? Are the clicks going that way? Are the views going that way? It's pretty easy to buy views and pretend like you have a following to have others take you seriously. It's known that you can Google, buy YouTube views, buy Instagram followers, and you can do that for very little money. Notoriously, we have a friend who, for a poll against another friend, paid $10 to win the poll. That was just like a gentleman's bet. The purpose of was just, what would you rather, A or B? And the person who was B said, I'll throw $10 behind this as a gag to win this debate. You can easily do this. And I think that part of the problem is we're getting away from cards a lot of times. The people that we're talking about, and especially myself, I won't speak for Chris or Josh, but the people that I'm talking about, don't know the first thing about cards, don't collect cards. They're here because they see a way for themselves to make money, or for themselves to have their 15 minutes or longer where people care about what they think. And to me, that's not an authentic content creator. And that person should be pushed out, not pushed out, but pivoted away from. We should not be putting money and views or likes or even attention towards people like that.
This might be my favorite piece so far. So I can do two things at once. I can agree with Kristina's statement that it is possible to buy views. It's possible to buy subscribers. It is possible to build up those vanity metrics and make them look better than they are. That is 100% true. That is 100% a thing that people have been using, influencers throughout time, especially in Instagram, whatever, because Chris talks about that. I am going to skip a little bit ahead of this next piece because it takes a little while for this to develop, and I do want to get to some other things. But really important thing, I can agree with what Kristina's saying and then also counter with, so what? Yes, people can buy these vanity metrics, but the problem is you're basically arguing that, again, on the one hand, you don't want to cast them out. You didn't want to go quite that strong, but you say pivot away from. The problem is you just said they bought the views. So who's left to pivot away? You're saying there aren't that many organic views. So it's a bit of a catch-22 you're creating here. You're telling me on the one hand, they're buying these views and these clicks, this engagement. So it's fake. So, and then on the other hand, you're telling people who already aren't watching to not watch it. That's not going to work. And also, if the idea is to get clout and to get attention, You actually need to eventually get actual attention. It might work if the content doesn't hold up to it. If the audience chooses not to watch the content because it's not good, you can probably trick them once. But then once they see, oh, well, how does this person have 100,000 subscribers? This stuff sucks. Okay, well, then I'm moving on. And then they're done. The product itself already sold itself or didn't sell itself. That's easy. But then the next piece of the puzzle, the next part that becomes really tricky coming forward, is that once you run past a certain point, you're going to have to be able to produce the goods. It's not good enough that you were able to get this, visual version of clout. You have to be able to produce the goods in order to maintain the audience. It goes back to what I said earlier about the whole watch time thing. That's important. And you can't trick YouTube very easily with that. And again, you're spending this money presumably to get this clout, but if you're not getting the result, then eventually you're just throwing money at nothing. It's the same thing as if somebody was doing shill bidding, but they never actually get a real bidder. You can keep putting up this card over and over and over again and selling it for record price after record price. But if no one's buying it, if no one's being tricked into paying a higher comp, and you never actually get a real bidder to win, then it defeats the point of the shilling. You actually have to eventually trick someone, a real person, into paying real money for this. And in the statement, Kristina says, we shouldn't be giving these people money. It was one of the things she mentioned on there. It's like, well, if you're giving somebody money, you're clearly liking whatever it is they're selling you, because you've agreed to actually give them money. Do you have any idea how hard it is in this space to actually convince someone to give you actual money? Collectors are cheapskates. I use the analogy a million times where I watch a lot of wrestling content, different wrestling podcasters and stuff. And some of them will go do a live stream, and someone will drop a $500 donation on a live stream for a wrestling podcast. Think about that. If somebody decides to super chat $2.99 or $1.99, it's practically a red letter day in sports card YouTube, because it's like $1.99. I can go buy a dollar bin thing at the card show for that. Card collectors are cheap when it comes to actual content. To them is cheap. Content to them is disposable. That's the great irony of this, is that most people will not throw money at this. And again, if we're talking Jeff Wilson, his job is an infomercial to sell his product. He actually wants people to pay money for that. So he could have 99% fake viewers, but if the viewers that are watching are actually patronizing his business, then who cares? The result is being accomplished either way. The point is, if there are no real engaged people, no one is actually spending money, then spending money to get bigger numbers vanity numbers that don't mean anything is pointless. And also at the same time, you're not really diverting anybody from the content then, because no one's actually watching. So which is it? Is there no actual people watching? Is it inauthentic? Therefore, you're talking to nobody? Or is there actually enough people watching that you're annoyed about it and want them to reverse course so that the pivoting actually works? Because a boycott, when no one's there, doesn't actually work. If no one is actually participating in the boycott because no one was using the product in the first place, it's not much of a boycott. So I get the idea, but it's like there's some inconsistencies here in the logic behind this. The call to action doesn't match up with the logic that precedes it, if you get what I'm saying. So we'll move on from there.
A couple follow-ups to that. I mean, based on the podcast, y'all calling out big fish, and you're sitting here saying people are buying views. I mean, are there top creators that you think are buying views on YouTube?
Of course there are. Of course there are. We've conducted our own private studies of these things, and beyond a shadow of a doubt, not only is it happening on YouTube, but it's also happening on my preferred platform of choice, which is Instagram, and it's happening on Twitter. It's happening on all the platforms. It's par for the course. There have been systematic studies done of this with respect to influencer culture as a whole. And some of the results of those studies, just look up influencer culture on Wikipedia to get a start, and then check the footnotes. And there's been studies performed that have determined that influencer culture in certain segments has somewhere between 10 to 20%. All the followers on these pages are fake. So that brings me to a question of, would you rather have one high quality follower? Would you rather have one Michael Saylor consuming your content? Or would you rather have 1,000, low quality followers, half of which are bots? To me, I think the answer is I'd rather have one high quality follower than 1,000 junk followers. And that's why in this hobby.
All right, here's my favorite part. This is one of the more controversial pieces of it, so I'm glad we're here. Okay, so first order of business. They conducted a private study. All right, so my friends, it is now time. I got to go full screen on this one. It is now time. And see, I've been here long enough now that I've lost my light. I've lost my light. This is, I need the warm glow of the content gods to facilitate and help me, because right now, my friends, it is time. It is what I promised, and it is what I must provide. There. The warm glow of the content gods now shines upon me. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time, my friends, for some scholarship. All right, look. This was one of my favorite pieces of this whole day, because Chris is citing, remember, this whole premise, one of the underlying ideas here is that we want to have more scholarly works. My friends, I was not, I didn't go super deep into academia to the point that I did a master's or a doctorate or whatever, but I was pretty well versed in what was going on in that area. And back in my schooling days, back in the University of Guelph, but we had a history department who had a dean who had been doing it for a very long time, and he taught a course called Historical Methods. And I'm going to cite something in a minute for you about that. Believe it or not, it is relevant to this, so you have to humor me. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that one of the key pieces, and this is the fundamental of fundamentals in scholarship, is you must cite your sources. So here, Chris is directly stating that they conducted some private studies. Well, my friend, it is time to provide those private studies in the interest of hashtag transparency, because you just cited a thing. It's like, definitively, what does that mean? And we were cited two different numbers if you paid attention. We talked about influencer culture, how 10 or 20% are fake, and then the analogies given is 50% fake. Those are two very different numbers. What is this study? Who did you conduct it with? Can we see the study? Is it publicly available? Or are you just citing a thing? Because I have studies that said that studies that are uncited are not to be trusted. 10 out of 10 dentists agree. You can't deny that because I'm not providing you the study, but I assure you it happened. I solicited private studies. The point is this. You can't cite a study that is supposed to strengthen your point and then just move on. What study? If I can see this, we have the stupid white paper for your goddamn indexes. I would like to see the goddamn study. So you can cite it if you want, but at least provide the study. And this isn't meant to be mean. Like, I'm actually just being serious. Like, you just cited something and then moved on without actually providing the thing. And it's not like I'm explicitly going like, oh man, we must send it out here. Like, look, you just said you did a private set of studies about this. And then you're then telling people to go to Wikipedia and check the footnotes. Okay, fine, we can do that. But then we're getting information about influencer culture in other categories. Does the sports art category, does it have a higher propensity for this? A lower propensity for this? An equivalent propensity for this? These are all critical things. These are things that I need in my hashtag scholarship, Chris Hoge. These are things I need in my hashtag scholarship. Now, one more thing in the vein of hashtag scholarship, since I'm on this topic, before I get back to the video. I mentioned about the studies that I did in history, and one of the courses that was delivered by the dean of the department was a course called Historical Methods. And the idea behind the course was to give background to the students on different understandings of not only the sources and different pitfalls and things related to it. It was basically like almost a course of how to research. They assumed that, by the time you get to university, you've done some research papers and all that. But they weren't content with that. They said, no, we'd like you to really take this. And it was a mandatory course. You had to take it. And it was the idea of just understanding some of the underlying pitfalls of some resources so that you could do a better job providing and citing sources properly and understanding their weaknesses and strengths. It was actually pretty in-depth in terms of the course itself. It was very well done, very well delivered. The dean was actually a really good professor who did a great job with it. Now, I still have a bunch of old textbooks sitting in some other shelves, but I keep this one not too far. This is called The Pursuit of History by John Tosh. This is the revised 3rd edition. Now, I don't remember if it was first year or the beginning of second year when I took the course, but that means it was between 19 and 20 years ago that I took this course, and I still have this textbook. This is the original. This is from that one. So, I wasn't joking about the hashtag scholarship. We got some hashtag scholarship, my friends. So I'm going to read you a little excerpt about this, and then I'm going to bring it back around to one of the things that Chris said a little bit earlier. I got it on the other screen, so that's why I pointed. I won't take too long on this. I'll read you just an excerpt of this. So this is from page 98 of The Pursuit of History. And even though it's a history thing, it still kind of applies to what we're talking about here, and I'll explain why in a second. It will be clear then that historical research is not a matter of identifying the authoritative source and then exploiting it for all it's worth, for the majority of sources are in some way inaccurate, incomplete, or tainted by prejudice and self-interest. Very pertinent here. I'm going to continue. The procedure is rather to amass as many pieces of evidence as possible from a wide range of sources, preferably from all the sources that have a bearing on the problem in hand. In this way, inaccuracies and distortions of particular sources are more likely to be revealed. The inferences drawn by the historian can be corroborated. Each type of source possesses certain strengths and weaknesses, considered together and compared against one another. There is at least a chance they will reveal the true facts or something very close to them. One more piece here and then we'll close the book. This is why mastery of a variety of sources is one of the hallmarks of historical scholarship. That is actually written in there. An exacting one, which is by no means always attained. One of the reasons why biography is often disparaged by academic historians is that too many biographers have studied only the private papers left by the subject, instead of weighing these against the papers of colleagues and acquaintances, and were relevant the public records of the period. That last section, the point of it is that you can only rely on a primary source, like an oral story, to a certain degree. And I used to read this actually annually, and I probably need to get back to it. It's probably about time I read it again. But the point is, you can only trust somebody's verbal testimony to a certain degree. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it. You can only trust somebody's verbal testimony to a certain degree because there's always an inherent bias in it. We're always going to be the heroes in our own story. We're only going to tell you what we think, and we may have very strong conviction on that. And you can believe us, and that's good. But the point is, that's still one vantage point. Chris, earlier in the conversation, started off with the idea that he was at Mint Collective, which already inherently is a more industry-driven kind of show. He's talking to people, and they're giving him feedback that there's content in the space that is turning them off. Well, it's turned them off so much they're at an industry event? I guess it's not turning them off that much. And again, you don't have to watch it. So it's this weird thing where like you're being told this thing that is almost inherently contradictory. Also, you're basically focusing your attention again on this tight group of people. So this is a small sample size, uncited sources, bare minimum information. And if you're saying it's turning them off, great. Why? Oh, it's clownish content. That's not specific enough. If you're going to then use this source, if this is your source, I talked to some people, well, then we need more information. The problem is you want to almost engage in this discourse. You want to have this conversation, but then you don't want to actually come armed with the real data. You talk about hard data and then you come without the hard data. It's the exact opposite. It's very amusing to me that it's like you've literally defied the rules of scholarship in trying to make your point about scholarship. So bottom line is, look, if you want to make this point, the better way to do it would have been to state that it literally is your opinion, because all I'm getting from you is your opinion. But then if you want to add these other things into it, great. So I talked to all these people at this industry thing, and they told me this. Well, now what you need to do in order to counterbalance it, and the goal isn't to get a perfect counterbalance. That's never legitimately possible. But maybe you need to figure out why some people actually watch the Jeff Wilson content of the world, even though we're not talking about Jeff Wilson, but we sort of are. If that's the reason, let's find out then what the people who actually do watch, what do they like about it? Is it just that they're ignorant and they don't know any better? Are they hate watching it? Well, if they're hate watching, guess what? You're not going to discourage them. So those numbers stay intact. And if you're accusing people of buying views, which people? What percentage? Is it the 10 or 20% or is it the 50%? Because your analogy was 50%, but your study that you cited, even though it was indirectly cited, it goes, look up Wikipedia, look up influencer culture, and look at the footnotes. Most of the time, there's a lot of footnotes. Which footnotes? But great, at least that directs us, points us in a direction. These other secret studies are not cited anywhere. So it's like, this is worthless to me. You're not actually giving me anything useful, but you're throwing stuff in that's supposed to bolster your argument, but it's not bolstering it. I'm not getting what I'm actually supposed to be getting. Hashtag scholarship. We are falling well short of hashtag scholarship, Mr. Hoge. Very short of some real hashtag scholarship. For goodness sake, I brought actual scholarship to this ridiculous video that I'm mocking. Did you bring scholarship? That book exists. You can find it. Not this copy, probably. They've done it. By the way, this shit's expensive. Stupid things are expensive, even still now. Like, God. I wanted to see if they had the newer editions, like $140. It's nuts. Anyway, all right, let's get back to the video here. But you get my point. Hopefully you understand what I'm trying to get at. I'm joking and serious at the same time. This did not meet the criteria of scholarship that was the ironic joke of this whole thing. We're not meeting that standard. We're being told about studies that are never fully cited, never vetted. I need more information. You're giving me this thing that's supposed to be like your big trump card, but it's like, no, that isn't how this works. You must give me the opportunity to then review. If we get your stupid white paper, then for goodness sake, give us these studies. Let's print them up. Let's go. Get Luber on this. He's good at making papers. But I don't care where you get it from, but at least make sure you cite that source. Let's do that. All right, let's go back to the video.
In
Oops.
particular, view counts and subscriber counts are incredibly misleading. Some of the best content out there that I consume has no more than a few hundred, maybe at the most a few thousand views on its videos, and just maybe a handful of subscribers, maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. The follower counts and the view counts, those simply are not indicative of quality. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that seeing the astronomical view counts, the 100,000, few 100,000 view counts and follower counts, is bad news, because the only thing that ends up attracting is influencer culture. And influencer culture sucks. It brings in people who have nothing to do with our space, who don't care about the industry, who don't care about collecting, who don't care about the hobby. And it's a magnet to them to come in, try an audience build among our collectors, try to hit the algorithms and bring in audiences that they can convert into customers of some kind, or that they can sell, or they can add to their email list, or that they can monetize in some way. And those people don't care about collecting. They don't own cards. They don't collect cards. They don't have any skin in the game. They will be more than happy to collect their customer list and then move on and try to pivot and sell those people into NFTs, or sell those people into some other adjacent category that they've determined is their next scheme.
For the record, until it got to the last section of that statement where he was talking about pivoting them into NFTs or something else, I was like, why are you taking on Ken Golden this way? Oh, you're not talking about Ken Golden. Sorry. No. Oh, the whole thing with Drake and the thing previously with other celebrities that you'd randomly throw into the lives trying to get clout. Never mind. Sorry, we're not talking about Ken Golden. We're talking about someone else. Sorry, moving on. The other thing as well, real quick with this piece, I forgot. Sorry, I forgot the stupid 100 verse one Michael Saylor versus 500 bots or something. Look, man, when it comes down to it, when it comes down to this stuff, it is up to the individuals to figure out what they want to see and what they want to do with it. And the truth is, whether it's one person or 1,000 people, whether it's high quality viewers or not high quality viewers, that you're not going to change that. You're just not. The audience does have the opportunity to watch it. There are people who are watching stuff that are not really fully engaged in it. They're not that interested. It's not their thing. And that's okay. But to state that, Michael Saylor just inherently is a superior quality view, well, it's always very possible he saw something and it's like, look, it wasn't about the clownish content. It wasn't about the dumb thumbnails or what. You do realize if there's dumb thumbnails and that's supposed to be the turnoff, well, then they never click on it in the first place, so they never know what the content is. There's still a lot of assumptions built into this whole premise that you're building out, and I can't really get back on any of them. Earlier today, Dustin, Sports Card Dad, I almost said Personal Finance Dad because I'm still stuck on the old name. That branding is going to take some time to get used to. But he did a video, his own version of time talking about this. But in his, he says he agrees with Chris with like 82% of his takes. I can't quite go that strongly. I agree with like Chris's 56.4% of his takes. Now, you may be curious how I'm that specific. Well, I have studies. I'd show them to you, but moving on.
You're saying those people aren't necessarily good for the hobby, that it's driving, I guess, people in the wrong direction? I mean, do you think that it's just the wrong people at the top? Like, what exactly is the take there?
It's not about the people, right? It's about the content, and it's about the decisions made with respect to what content is going to come out. So I don't think it's terribly hard, given the access to tools that we have today, to produce content that is, accurate and that is insightful and that takes a long-term approach to collecting and that instructs and shares information about long-standing hobby traditions and things that have come to pass in this hobby over many years and that exist for a reason. Even if it's something as simple as, before making a piece of content about a card, looking at the checklist and understanding all the different parallels that are available, and then looking at the prices of those parallels and seeing how the market has developed over time for those different parallels, and then comparing to other similar players and different players within those sets, and sort of trying to develop an approach that finds something novel, that says something worth listening to, right? Rather than, sort of just hyping and pumping. And, look, there's the approach that we've taken forces the audience member to make a decision. There's some people who come to the point of view of, well, that's a negative opinion. We want to hear all content is good, so we don't want to hear this negativity. That position is logically inconsistent, because if you're okay with all content, then you have to be okay with our skeptical, pessimistic content too. And if you're not okay with our pessimistic, skeptical content, then you're negative too. You're just negative about what we're making, whereas we're negative about the hypey, pumpy, oh, let's get rich quick, jump from one fad to the next content. So we've taken a position that actually forces people to decide. And you don't have to agree with us. That's fine. You don't even have to like our content. I don't even like half of our content. We just make the content because, it's fine. I hate many of the things that I say. I hate what I sound like. I hate what I look like. But I still put myself out there. I still have things to say. But the bottom line here is that when we take this position, it forces people to choose. And people do need to choose. And they either need to get on board and adopt the current standard bearers in our content industry, or they need to ask for something better.
This is why I said this would be very problematic a video, because I want to go into the level of depth and talking through a lot of the components of it. And I'm only 23 minutes through. So I'm going to have to skip through a good chunk of this going forward for the rest of this thing to hopefully get to the end, because there's at least one more piece that I want to touch on before I end the video. So real quick, there are like 8 things in this, and I'm not going to go into each and every one of them, but I'm going to try to hit a couple real quick. One of them is that this, again, goes back to doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on the premise that, again, there is a unified desire of certain kind of content. We have to choose. We do. Every single day, people choose. They click on certain ones. They don't click on other ones. They're choosing constantly. They're always making a choice. Those thumbnails do work. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news on this. The metrics prove it. And one thing I think Dakota touched on briefly, but I'll touch on it here. And that's why at the very beginning of this whole thing, I gave you that preamble where I talked about what my channel is and what it isn't. It's a hybrid channel that covers a lot of these little buckets, these little categories that I talk about. And the problem with that is that you don't get the full breadth, the full impact of one specific category where you do if you fully go into it. However, what you do get, the advantage of it, is that you actually get a bit of a taste of what the different categories will do for you. Because when I do a spicier video or a more controversial take, or I go into depth of this, some people are really into that. Some people are not. When I do the pickup videos, or I talk about a showcase, or I do whatever, it basically narrows you down to a very specific set of folks that care, and everybody else ignores it. Collector-focused content actually does worse on the same channel with the same subscriber base than the more newsy stuff, the more salacious stuff, the more controversial stuff, the more argumentative stuff, the stuff where you're actually going in and like, okay, I have a take. This is my take. Let's talk about it. That instantaneously has a little bit more draw. If it covers the market or talks about, prices going up, prices going down, what's happening with Mark's cards, those things. SGC does a thing. PSA does a thing. Those get more views. That is not a question. That is a legitimate statement. Kristina asked earlier on, who said, do the clicks? Yes, they do. Regardless of how many people you think are buying views or not, the majority of people are not. And the proof is in the pudding. The numbers don't lie. Don't make me get the Scott Steiner meme. The numbers don't lie, and they spell disaster. But in this case, they spell reality. For the most part, those view counts are accurate enough. They don't have to be 100% accurate. They're accurate enough to tell you which content is getting gravitated to and which one is not. Now, Chris here says, again, we have to choose. Again, we already do. And the idea is, we have to. No, you don't. As a viewer, you can choose to watch all of it. You can choose to watch none of it. You can choose to watch the content creators that have the message the way that you want it delivered. You can choose the ones that have the quote-unquote best personality, the one that have the best presentation, the one that have the highest production values. You can choose what you want to watch based on any criteria you want. That is your right as the viewer. That is the honest truth and the honest reality. So I'm done with this for now. I do want to make another video about the whole concept of content, but I'm going to do it down the road. Maybe we'll do it in a debate format. But there's one more element that I want to touch on that they talked about. I'm going to skip ahead to it because frankly, I don't have enough daylight left to deal with the rest of this. So it took me this long to get through 23 minutes, 24 minutes of this. So I'm going to get to the last piece that I want to touch on, and we'll go from there. One more piece of hashtag scholarship for you. Okay, so here's the piece that I want to touch on. There's going to be 2 parts to this. One is a full-fledged scholarship piece, and another piece pertains to the actual piece of scholarship that I brought in. Remember that piece where I said, and I explained, that verbal testimonies are good and all when accompanied by other pieces of information, but in and of themselves are not good enough. They're just not. That's why I say I have to hold this to a higher standard, because academic rigor demands it, number one. And number two, someone who passed law school would understand that simply verbal testimony doesn't always hold up. That's eyewitnesses are very unreliable. Well, verbal testimony is also kind of unreliable for a multitude of reasons, some of which I covered there. But let's play this last clip here, and then we'll close off with some final thoughts.
That stuff is repelling people. It is pushing them away who otherwise might take it seriously. And, I have anecdotes about this from many people that I've met. But I'll tell you from my own personal vantage point, the reason why I'm involved in this hobby is because I did it as a kid, and then I came back in 2016. And at that time, the content landscape didn't even exist. There was basically no hobby content available outside of, breakers and, the stray podcast episode here and there. There's no content.
All right, I'm ending on this piece. And by the way, Dakota, shame on you for nodding your head. How dare you? Not nodding your head. Disgrace. There's way more to that conversation, by the way. I'll leave a link in the description for you. Check it out yourself and watch it in real time without my commentary. But if you're clicking on this, you wanted my commentary, apparently. So this is on you. Don't blame me for this. Again. Okay. So 2 pieces to this. Back again to the I talked to some people. That's great. Who? Who did you talk to? I assume it was the main collective. Okay, great. What do they have to say? What were their exact words? What did they actually... Again, this doesn't help me. I talked to a guy. Hey, Chris, I went to the guy. I talked to him at the local Starbucks, and he said, hey, who's the bald guy talking about things? He sucks. Is that true? No, I didn't make it out to Starbucks today. It's not true. But that's the beauty of a verbal testimony. It's like, what? You don't believe me? I am the Carlos. Look, my face is on the logo. Like, that's useless. I talked to a guy. I talked to some people. They said a thing. The whole homogenous whole said a thing? Was it like one person? Was it 10 people? Was it 50 people? Was it 100 people? That I'm teasing and I'm poking fun at it, but like the truth is, this is not a very good argument. I talked to some people and they said they were turned off by this. Are these people also your friends who know about your contentious history with some of these content creators in question? So like, I don't have enough information to even determine if I should even give credence to the conclusions you drew from these very detailed conversations that you're not sharing. Again, cite your sources, please. If you're going to bother using this to strengthen your argument, could you at least cite some sources? Hashtag scholarship? Could we do that? Okay, last piece. All right, and you know what? I'm bringing it up one more time. There, hashtag scholarship time. And I'm finishing with this. I've made my point. I genuinely believe that content is very much in a constant referendum based on the way that YouTube and other platforms operate. The proof is in the pudding as far as the viewership, the listenership, how much the analytics that we can draw from. We can actually pull real analytics and see not only how many people listened, how many people watched, the amount of time they watched. So we can get a whole bunch of information. That information is available. You can pull and draw that data, and it gives you a lot of information to go off of. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Are there people that buy some of these vanity metrics in order to look better and sound better? Of course, 100% absolutely. Is that enough to make a difference? No, not really. Not in my opinion anyway. But the bigger point that I want to make here for you is that in the context of looking and listening to this conversation in its entirety a couple times, is that last piece that I wanted to cite for you. And again, there was plenty more. I think they talked for another half hour. So you're more than welcome to check it out. There's plenty more in there if you want to look at it. And probably more examples I could pull, but this video is long enough. Probably longer than the original video. The bottom line here is this. When you're looking at this content, you got to remember not only citing the sources is important, but also consider the source that you're getting this argumentation from. In this, Chris, in that last clip, told you what you need to know about this. His version of his view on content is put through the prism of somebody who came back to the hobby in 2016, which is fine. That's not a crime. I want to be clear on that. You remember at the beginning of the video, if you're still here, thank you for that. And if you could hit the like button, I'd appreciate it. But if you remember at the beginning of the video, I gave you an outline. It took me minutes to go through it, but I gave you an outline of how this channel got to where it is today and what it is not. It was important that I do that at the very beginning because it is the prism by which I then talk through everything else that I talked through in this video. You need that context because then you can decide if you are comfortable with what I'm saying, if it makes sense to you, if it doesn't make sense to you, if I'm out to lunch, but at least you understand where I'm coming from, and then you can gauge where you feel about it based on that. Chris here tells us that he came back to the hobby in 2016, and he says in 2016, the content landscape was basically non-existent. There was no content. Here's the thing. That is 100% factually wrong, however you want to slice it. That is completely wrong, could not be more wrong if you tried. Hashtag scholarship. Here it is, my children. He's wrong. Why is he wrong? Well, because he either A, was ignorant of what was out there and didn't actually look hard enough, or B, he didn't find the content he was looking for, which is not what he said. He said there was no content. There was. Or C, he is being disingenuous. And there are other possibilities, of course. But like, regardless, we're either being ignorant or we're intentionally fabricating something because there was content. And the problem and the reason why we have this ambiguity and we don't know which one of these things it is because great mistake number one on this situation, which it seems to be the case with a lot of this conversation, you did not define the parameters clearly enough. What is content? If you're talking about podcast long form content in 2016, I can probably get behind you on that. There wasn't much of it, to my recollection. I was around. So probably, if that's what you want to go with, sure, I'm with you. Blogs are content, right? The written word, blogs go back way further than 2016, and there were tons of them. There's a whole graveyard of blogs that were abandoned years ago, but many of them were prolific for years, well before 2016, and they were still operating in 2016. I can assure you of that. That's content. Okay, what about people debating and arguing over the various matters of the day and research and history and all those good things? What about forums and message boards? If you're a vintage card collector in the baseball space, you go to Net54 forums. Why? Because they've got posts going back to 2001. There's still information on there of people doing research. There are links to ebooks and PDFs that the people created for research on different topics. Scholarly work, dare I say. But the point is, that goes back to 2001. That is 15 years before 2016. That's content. That is content. What about Usenet? That predates the message board and forums. You really can't access it very easily. Most of that stuff's kind of gone. Reccollecting.sport.hockey, reccollecting.sport.baseball, reccollecting.sport.football, reccollecting.sport, I think it was basketball. I think it was just written as basketball. Whatever. The point is, that existed, and that predated the message boards and forums. That was going back into the mid-ish 90s. Okay? That's content. Is it content in the format that you would think of it today? Not so much, but it's still content. I'm sorry. So it existed. It existed 20 years before he came back? That goes back quite a ways, I'm afraid. Beyond that, we also have something along the lines of, okay, let's just go to YouTube here. Well, I mentioned at the beginning that I don't think some of the content is very good. I don't think it holds up that great. Again, I think it was recorded and filmed with a potato. However, going back in the early 2010s, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of YouTube videos from legitimate collectors talking about their hobby, talking about their preferences, talking about their favorites, talking about showcases, their sets, going into the kind of detail sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, that you mentioned that was mentioned earlier in this live stream. And they did it back in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. All of this predates 2016. All of it. Before that, live streams, they had a thing called Blog TV. I remember it. I didn't really participate in it. But they had nascent communities there built around that, people coming and going and talking about different things, life as well as cards, but they had a community built around that whole idea. That predates YouTube. So we're already well behind 2016. By the time we get to 2016, there are literally years worth of content available if you're looking for it. Now, you got to remember, Chris and the Card Ladder team are very much into the basketball side of things. So was there as much basketball content as these other sports? No. Basketball honestly wasn't that popular for the most part for a lot of folks. The baseball and the football and even hockey north of the border held much more sway. There were basketball fans, of course, basketball collectors, but it wasn't the same depth. So you didn't get as much content. So if you're looking predominantly for basketball, I can totally understand why you would believe that there wasn't any content. But I assure you, sports card content, there was aplenty. In very different categories, very different ways. Beckett, I think, had a podcast as well fairly early on. The name escapes me. I think it was maybe just Beckett Live or something, whatever. But you got to go back. Is a lot of the stuff archived? Not really, not very well. But even some of the basketball podcasts that I listen to, I think it's either Wax Museum, I think it's Max Museum Podcast, I want to say, talked about some of the old forums in an episode. And they were a source of content. They were a source of collectors getting together, congregating, and discussing these things. That was content. So my bottom line on all of this quick history lesson, is to add a little more hashtag scholarship to this, but also to make the point that Chris got something fundamentally wrong here. Fundamentally wrong. So he's coming in with the prism that content didn't exist before 2016, which is completely 1000% incorrect. And if that's the prism by you're going on it, then you're going to have a very different view, a skewed view of what constitutes content, what doesn't constitute content. Again, there was a lot more debate and a lot more contentious pieces on this live stream. I recommend you go watch it. Check out the link in the description. I'm done with this today. But the bottom line that I'll get to beyond this point is that beyond everything I just said, everything on there, when you look at it through this prism, you're then looking at it in that everything you said going forward and in going into it is that you don't just want content, you want the content that fits your criteria. And again, you failed to make the most basic argument in the first place. And the most basic argument was that, oh, we need this additional content to appease these serious-minded, investor-minded, conservative-minded folk. Well, number one, you haven't convinced me that they're necessary. You haven't. There was plenty of money flooding into the hobby when there's money to be made. I'm sure there are people on the conservative side of the spectrum that just saw money to be made and they came in and took it. They didn't really care about, they didn't need scholarship at that moment. Now, the idea is, oh, we're more sophisticated now. I always question that. That goes under the collectors are getting smarter and we're more sophisticated. I'm going to push back on that. However, even if that's true, great, make it. Fund it. Find some people that'll join you on this venture and create that content. Making that content that appeals to that niche audience, and it is a niche audience, a niche of a niche, doesn't stop the rest of the content from going out. You do not have the power nor the ability nor the mandate from the hobby. I'm going to tell you right now, you don't have the mandate. I don't need to be a leader in the hobby to know you don't have the mandate. You have maybe your friends and people who will back you up and be like, yeah, you're right, Chris. No, you're going to have a lot of other people who are going to push back and go like, you're not going to tell me what to do. Kick rocks. And that's whether they like you, they don't like you, or they fall somewhere in between. And one other piece of advice I would give to Chris and the Card Ladder team when they're thinking about this, and I really want you to take this to heart and really think about it. Most of the hobby doesn't operate inside of the segment where they're ultra focused in on this stuff. The reason why a lot of this content is very niche is because most people engaged in the hobby really aren't concerned about the content, good, bad, or indifferent. They're just not. That's why we don't have the numbers. That's why we don't have a PewDiePie over here. We just don't. Most people fall into the category of they're either super engaged in it, they're marginally engaged in it. The majority of people don't really care one way or the other. If they do check out some content, it's very transient. They'll watch an episode or two of something here and there. And it's not about whether they're repulsed or not. It's just a matter of they're just not that interested. They got other things to do. This is a thing. It is a hobby. I've always pushed back against the idea that this is to be taken seriously. It's not that serious. I had a lot of fun kind of putting some hashtag scholarship on the whole deal. But it's not that serious. It never was. It's never been. And it doesn't matter how much of this you try to interject into it. It never will be serious. It doesn't matter how much money you put into it. For some people, it will become serious. But for a lot of us that are hobbyists at heart and at our core, this is not serious stuff. Real life can be serious. Cards are not. Cards are usually an escape from seriousness. And that's kind of what they're supposed to be, even whether the money's involved or not. And we're all at different levels. For some of us, the big dollars really don't sway them. For other people, they're a block. So trying to increase, grow the hobby, quote unquote, is pushing some of the very people out that are the rank and file and the lifeblood and the baseline of the hobby. If you just want rich folks doing it, well then go collect Fabergé eggs. There are plenty of rich toys for those people that want to operate in that space. And that doesn't mean that there can't be expensive cards. There certainly can be. But there's plenty of room in the space for all. The truth is, in order to try to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish, there was no need to worry about what any of the other content was, because if the content that you want to create, and this is what I'm going to leave you on, if the content that you want to create, Chris and Card Ladder team, is so important, and it is so quality, and it is so good, the cream rises to the top. If it is truly that good, it will rise above the noise around it. That you feel the need to try to get people to pivot away from the noise around it tells me it cannot hold up on its own. It's not good enough on its own. It doesn't have enough staying power on its own. Because otherwise, it would rise above it all and be right there where you expect it to be and be seen by the people you want to expect it to be seen by. I don't think Michael Saylor was turned off by hello sports card investors nearly as much as Bitcoin was a better avenue for what he wanted to do. You couldn't have offered him anything card-wise that would have made it otherwise. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. This might be a world record long video that isn't alive. So, condolences or you're welcome. Other videos on the channel coming up. They won't be as long as this one. Otherwise, Friday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time will be the live stream. And we'll have more nonsense, and we may talk about this some more, but I'll get the panel of other people to talk about it and add their own hashtag scholarship to the proceedings. That's it for me for now. Thanks very much. We'll catch you in the next one.